As we continue to talk about communicating with God and the fact that as saints, as priests, we actually have not only the right to communicate to God, but in some aspects, it involves our priestly service to God, such as praise, which is the fruit of our lips confessing his name. So, as we go on with looking at communication, I want to look at supplication. And supplication is a cry for help. We see over in Philippians chapter 4 and verse 6, Paul states, "You all be anxious in nothing, but in everything with prayer," that is, that prayer of worship, which is expressing what God has done, "and supplication." Now, supplication, of course, is a cry for help. We are to supplicate for all men. And we see that over in 1 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 1, where it says, "Therefore I encourage you first to make supplication, worship, intercession, and thanksgiving concerning all men." So supplication is another aspect of the communication that we have with God where we do actually cry out for help. It's not just crying out for help for ourselves, but also for others. Now, it's important to understand what it means to cry out for help and how God actually answers that. Because we get examples of this. Like with Christ, we have an example over in Hebrews chapter 5 and verse 7, where it says, "Who in the days of his flesh, supplications and requests towards the one who is inherently able to save him out from the death, with strong cries and tears he offered up, and he was heard by his reverence." Yet Christ went to the cross and Christ died. However, it very clearly states that God not only heard him, but in understanding over in 1 John, when God hears us, we receive whatsoever we ask. We see that Christ did actually get a response from the Father. What was the Father's response? He raised Christ from the dead. You think about that. When it comes to who we are in Christ and what we have, it's a direct result of the supplication of Christ. He supplicated to the Father, and the Father saved him out from death by raising him from the dead. We also see another example of this with Zacharias, where he is supplicating to God. This is over in Luke chapter 1 and verse 13. He's supplicating to God for a child, and God heard him and responded. However, when you read it a little bit more into the story, you see that there was a little bit of a catch to it. What was that catch? Well, he was to name that son John. This was so ridiculous to him that he actually was forced to remain silent until he was willing to do what God asked and named his son John. We also see another example of supplication with Paul in Israel. Over in Romans chapter 10 and verse 1, Paul writes, "Indeed, brethren, the kind disposition of my heart and the supplication, the one facing God concerning Israel, is unto salvation." Did God hear Paul? Israel wouldn't accept the gospel that Paul brought, but yet God did hear. What did God do? God destroyed the temple so that Israel could no longer offer up sacrifices that were of no value. He scattered the nation so that they could no longer be in a position where they continued to defy God. But yet, God has very clearly stated he will preserve a remnant, and Israel will be saved. Over in James chapter 5 and verse 16, we see that the strong supplication of a righteous man is very active, or it's working. A supplication is a cry for help. That cry doesn't necessarily mean that we get to put conditions on it as to how that help is going to come. So remember, as Paul said over in Philippians chapter 4 and verse 6, "Be anxious for nothing." But there are times where we need to supplicate. We need to cry out for help in everything, with a prayer of worship that is giving God credit for what he has done, and supplication after thanksgiving. Let your requests be known before God. I almost forgot to mention, John, who was born to Zechariah, was described as the greatest man in relation to the kingdom of the heavens. That involves the Messiah in Israel. Christ was raised from the dead to never again face death.